You are listening to the Practising the Art of Small Business podcast with Shannyn Merlo and Julie Parker. Join their conversation about business, leadership, and the self-awareness journey to greater success.
Hello, Julie and listeners. Welcome to episode 16 of Practising the Art of Small Business. Julie, how are you?
I'm super well. Thanks so much for asking, Shannyn.
It is my pleasure. It is also always my pleasure when I've been pondering what to talk about in our podcast, and in our pre-recording, you just happened to bring up the topic that I want to talk about. We're like synced in.
Yeah.
And so what did we sync on this morning or today, Julie?
Syncing of our thinking brought us to the topic of difficult discussions.
Oh, it's the best thing to have.
It's a meaty subject and causes much anxiety with many people.
It really does. It really does. It's almost like I get the feeling, and maybe this is just my own experience, but it is one of the most avoided things that humans do with each other broadly. Would you? I mean, that's a very gross.
Oh, I completely agree with you. And when I owned my own practice, that's when I became truly accountable, and I just had to front up and have these difficult discussions. Couldn't get out of them anymore.
One of the reframes that I've done with regard to difficult discussions before we get into how do we do it was I was having a difficult discussion with my father. And we're not going to get on the therapy couch here.
This could get interesting.
But my dad was saying, and my dad was quite rifled up. We were having a difficult discussion. And my dad said to me, "I just don't like confrontation." And I said, "Dad, this shouldn't be confronting. We are just having a conversation." And simply by the reframe, because I don't think there's too many people who wake up in the morning relishing a confrontation. But if we can change the narrative around it and kind of say, look, this is a conversation. This is an opportunity to communicate. This is an opportunity to get to know each other better, build a stronger relationship. Then does that change the context of the difficult conversation? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we have to embrace these seemingly difficult discussions, because the reason why we're having it in the first place is because something's become intolerable, and everything gets much better at the end of it. We just have to make sure that the middle bit, the actual discussion, goes as well as it can. And I think addressing the reasons why we are so uncomfortable with these sort of discussions is a good idea to touch on. And just contemplating around that, one of the things that has made me resist difficult discussions is because I didn't want to make the situation even worse, because I didn't manage the discussion properly. That at the end of the discussion, the other person would be even more upset, and then it would be irretrievably damaged, the relationship, and where do we go to from there? So I think that could possibly be one of the reasons why we resist these sort of discussions. We don't want to make it worse. Yeah. And I certainly think another one is that we fear the unknown. We fear what the reaction is going to be in that other person. What if they cry? What if they get angry and upset? What if they completely disengage? And I feel like I damage their soul.
And really interesting that you say that, because I was writing something prior to our podcast, and those were very much along the lines of why I think people avoid having some of these difficult conversations. It is very much about I don't know how everyone will react, and therefore I can't control the situation, and therefore I can't control myself, and therefore I don't want to do it at all. And so I think that there's a lot of fear that comes in. So if we acknowledge that fear is in play here, I'm afraid that you're going to have a bad reaction. And it's not so much you're going to have a bad reaction. I believe it's about you're going to have a bad reaction and I won't be able to cope with that.
Oh, I like it. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Because it's more so about if I can trust that I can navigate through however you are going to respond or react, then technically I should be okay with it. But it's really about our fear that when I confront you or have a conversation with you, a discussion with you, and I'm going to potentially hit your hurty bits, and then
my hurty bits. Ooh, sounds raw and tender.
That is actually a technical coaching term for anyone who would like to know. Yes. And as a result of that, you're going to potentially then want to hurt my hurty bits. And what I'm really afraid of is having my hurty bits hurt.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm just avoiding having my own hurty bits hurt. I suppose the other thing is there are often people who say to me, I don't want to hurt them. And so the question is like, okay, but what are you protecting them from? Because we can't protect everyone from all the stuff that could possibly come out of our mouths and cause harm, especially if it's not with malicious intent.
Yeah. And it does lead me to think that empathy should be playing a strong role whenever you're approaching a difficult discussion. Sometimes we could be forgiven for feeling that we have to go in all hell. What is it? What's blazing?
Guns.
Guns.
Bang, bang.
That's right. All guns blazing. So we are bombastic in the way we say things. We put up such a wall for their response that they are like a deer in the headlights and they go scuttering off. And at least you've had that discussion and you haven't had to deal with the impact of it and the resulting reaction from the other person. But it doesn't solve the problem, does it, of let's manage this as well as possible. And if one of your values as a human being is to not be damaging to people, to be supportive of other people, you don't want to approach the discussion in that way. And you don't actually need to. And if you come from an empathetic space, one of the best techniques that I had when I had to start fronting up to these discussions was to go out on a contemplative walk and really put myself in the other person's shoes. How, in her position, his position, would I like the information delivered to me in a way that wasn't going to get my defenses up, was going to be an acknowledgement that it was an uncomfortable space for me, and to be supportive in that space as well.
Empathy is a really great word to use. And I actually have been learning myself about empathy. Well, it's
so late in life to come across the term, Shannyn.
I know. Look, someone said Shannyn empathy, and I had to look it up. No, not quite, but because it's such a great leadership quality, being able to articulate what is empathy and how do you do it is something that's really important for us coaches and for leaders to actually go, oh yes, no, I'm empathetic, but what does it actually mean to be empathetic? How do I live being empathetic? And quite often people can't explain it, and it's a trait that you can learn. So in the learning part of our podcast today, we're going to learn how to be empathetic. So
I love it.
Empathy, what you said about putting yourself in the other person's shoes, is a really great example of being empathetic. But having an empathetic conversation, there are some qualities with regard to being really curious and being non-judgmental. Sorry.
That's stuck in your throat. Non-judgmental.
Empathy, being curious and being non-judgmental. And curious is something that's come up a lot for me recently with clients, is when we come with a spirit of curiosity and non-judgmentalness, then we don't necessarily have to dictate to the person this challenging conversation, but we can be curious about how they're experiencing this situation. Why did they do what they did? Help me to understand your thinking by explaining your thinking, and really being curious about trying to understand the situation or the perspective from the other person's shoes, so that you can then go, okay, with that knowledge and that understanding, how can we navigate through this conversation with grace and ease and getting to the other side so that we both feel like we've been heard and we've both got good outcomes from this conversation.
Yeah, that's very good. And I think it helps identify there are 3 points of view here. There are 3 perspectives here that if addressed and brought into the equation, it may feel like a more balanced discussion at the end of it. One of those is, how does the other person feel, want, need, desire? You as the deliverer, what do you need, want, desire? But also with these, because this is a business podcast, there are business requirements which are making you go to that person in the first place because there's a concern that you have. You're not treating our customers in a friendly way, and therefore it's having an impact on our bottom line. And if business owners don't make smart business decisions, then the viability of the business goes down and everyone is then at risk. And so the business needs really need to be held in high esteem and high regard. And but to be able, as a business owner, to be able to separate yourself from that entity in that discussion, I think is helpful. So, for example, Shannyn, you're not coming up.
Now I'm in trouble. We're about to have a difficult conversation. Stay on board, guys. I didn't know that this was coming up. I may cry. I probably won't cry.
I'm going to cry. Don't cry. I've got the tissues. I'm prepared. I've got tissues for you and a therapist. So if I had to come to you and say, Shannyn, you've been coming in late every day, I've noticed. I'm just wanting to check in with you, make sure everything's okay. And of course, I'm summarizing here. You know, I hear you, Shannyn, you've got issues going on for you personally, and you're finding the mornings really difficult. I would love to be able to allow you to come in a bit later to make it easier on yourself at the moment. However, because of the business, we have clients coming in the doors from 9 o'clock in the morning onwards. We really do need to be up and running and be fully staffed from 9 in the morning onwards. And so to be able to separate yourself, that this isn't just me dictating to you the way I want you to behave. The business has requirements. I would love to be able to work with you more in this, but I'm a bit restrictive because of what the business needs. And there's another thing that's popped into my mind, which kind of lends itself to this. So I heard someone say this a few months ago. It has stuck with me ever since, because I think it's true, that if you've got 2 warring parties, you've got 2 people in a bit of conflict, 2 team members in conflict, and one team member comes in vulnerable. You know, it's made me feel sad. It's made me remember back to days I was bullied at primary school and I so hated it, and and, you know, maybe there's a few tears. The natural human response, normal human response, there are going to be other people who are a bit, you know, outside the norm and that don't respond this way, but the normal human response to vulnerability is empathy. And that's how you can start breaking down the conflict between 2 people. When one can come to the party vulnerable, the other party comes to that, then extends out some empathy. If you can generate that, be aware of that within one of these discussions, I think it certainly helps. Because when we come in bombastic saying, this is the company line, it just has to be this way, bad luck, I'm not interested in what led you to drop in performance in that particular way, then there is no space there for mutual understanding and walking away with a deeper awareness of where things are at for the business and each other. However, if you are coming in, and there's a lovely term that Dr. Gabor Mate, he is a Hungarian psychoanalyst of sorts, and he's a wonderful person to he's got courses and stuff around healing. He's got this lovely term, compassionate inquiry. And I think if we come into these discussions as a business owner or a manager of people with compassionate inquiry in our brains, and what you're talking about, you know, being curious around what's going on for the other person, when you come in like that, you are changing the dynamics of that communication completely. You are interested in what is going on for that other human being, and they will meet you more likely in the middle with that, rather than become defensive or closed off or shut down.
It's interesting how if we as humans go into a difficult conversation with our guard up and with our this is how it is, this is how it's going to be, the natural reaction of the other person can often be quite closed off and more defensive as a result. Whereas if we come in with a desire for them to be heard, then quite often, in my experience certainly, once the person has had an opportunity to be heard and to tell their story, whatever that story is, their side, their point of view, their experience, what have you, then you almost get to the other side because their defenses have been dropped, because they have been heard. And quite often my experience is that most people just want to be heard. Most people just want to be listened to. And once they're listened to, they're actually more able to accept the next step, whatever that next step is. What are your thoughts in your
I completely agree. I completely agree. And I heard a quote through this very past week, and I hate it when I use quotes that some people roll their eyes at when I say who, like I think I quoted Dr. Phil in one of our episodes.
That was me rolling my eyes.
This one was Oprah.
Oh
my
dear.
God.
Julie, edit this bit out.
But she said the three most powerful words she believes are not, I love you. It's, I hear you. And I think that comes pretty close, that we do have an innate need for people to get where we're coming from, to be heard. I mean, why else do we become very defensive in these sort of discussions and say, no, you don't understand me though? And you think about how we react in loving relationships with our partner. Oh my God, the need for validation and the need to be heard is enormous. With our parents as well. This is me. And so I think there's a lot of evidence in our past relationships that the need to be heard is high. And so if we are providing that for the other person, we are more so creating an environment for that other person to be flexible, also understanding as well, rather than be resistant to coming to your side and seeing it from your perspective at all. And Jay Abrahams said in a presentation, your employees, you need to go to them inquiring about what their reality is first before you can ever expect them to care what the business reality is. And I think that's an interesting point as well.
Yeah. And what came up for me was the argument that often is brought back to me when we have these discussions is, yes, but I want to be heard as well. Like, I'm the business owner. I'm the one with the problem. I want to be heard as well. And there's a really tough friction, I think, that happens there, because on the basis that everyone does want to be heard and most business owners operate in isolation, we know that one of the reasons why people utilize us is because we're the one person that they can have these conversations with and be heard. So we know that that's why coaches exist. So the business owner is often projecting their own need to be heard onto their team members. But what we need to do is bring it back and say, it's almost like that, how we've not really gone into your parent-child discussions too much, but we need to do this more, Julie. So Julie describes leadership, if we think about leadership from a parent-child dynamic. So in this scenario, it really depends on what your relationship with your parents was like. But again, let's not go into that. But as the parent in this leadership discussion, it's really up to you to be the parent, and it's not about you necessarily being heard. You need to help your employee, your team member, to be heard, so that they let their walls down so that you can be heard. But if we start off with this is how it needs to be, I want you to listen to me, I want you to hear me, we're not going to get anywhere. And certainly the team member is not going to have a positive experience from that. And as a result, you're probably not going to have a very good experience from it.
Yeah. And just to clarify, when I talk about the parent-child frame, I don't talk about it to diminish the role of a team member to that of a child at all. What I'm saying is that quite often what I have found, that when you put a frame of parent-child around your relationship that you have with your team members, what that indicates is the level of authority, the level of leadership that you have in that environment. And it helps us to make smarter decisions when we go, gosh, what would I do? How do I shift the bad attitude that's creeping in with Shannyn? What am I going to do about that? I must just have a talk to her about it. But when you think, okay, let's say we're in a different type of frame, such as a parent-child, where I had that equivalent level of authority and leadership over the other person, over the Shannyn, then, okay, if she was my child, what would I do? I would naturally inquire, what's going on for you? Is it what's going on for you? Because I've noticed that you're talking back to me all the time. What are you angry about? What's upset you? And so quite often when you think about your situations that crop up within your business relationships and you think, what would I do if in a parent-child situation? It delivers the answer quite easily.
Okay, so we've been sort of talking a bit higher level about theory of difficult conversations, for want of a better term. Maybe we could go into the metrics of how you could structure a difficult conversation, almost like mapping this out as an agenda. What do you think, Julie? Would that be helpful?
Magnificent. Love a good recipe.
I love a recipe. So one of the things that I often recommend and have done so myself is it's a little bit on brand. So forgive me for just promoting Inspired Outcomes Consulting. But I think about what is the outcome that I want to have at the end of the conversation. So this is in the pre-planning. I really think I do when I'm having a difficult conversation. I really think, what is the outcome that I want? Because really that frames how I'm going to attend that conversation. Because if I want the outcome for the person to be, to feel good and to be empowered to create change, then I will need to frame the conversation in a way that that is the outcome. And I also like to encourage leaders to have that as part of the agenda right up front. The outcome that I would like, what is the outcome that you'd like to have from this conversation? This is the outcome I'd like to have from the conversation. So that it's very upfront around, at the end of this, here is what success looks like for both of us. So that it creates almost a safe journey at the start of how we're going to be at the end. What are your thoughts on my outcome-focused conversations?
I think it is magnificent, like everything that comes out of your mouth, Shannyn.
Love it.
And it's like a reverse engineer process, isn't it? And it's recognizing, let's actually have a goal. The goal isn't just to have the conversation and get through the end of that conversation. The goal is to have, I imagine most of the time, the goal is to have the change, but have the two people happy with each other at the end of that change as well. And recognize that we play an enormous role in creating the environment for that person to come on board with us down that journey. And they're not going to come on board with us. It's not going to be creating the right environment for that to happen if we are arrogant, if we are insistent, rude, not looking at things from their perspective, just coming in with our agenda without any care for their agenda. And that's where, as well, all those more negative, unhelpful feelings bubble to the surface. I'm not being heard. I'm resisting everything. I've got a bad attitude now. Now I'm rolling my eyes. I've slammed the door. I've walked out. Here's my resignation. That's what we all fear. But it is about recognizing what the goal is, and what environment do you need to create in order for that to be a likely outcome.
Because I'm quite sure that most people who are entering into a difficult conversation don't have in their mind, I want this person to storm out. I want to have my hurdy bits poked. I want to poke their hurdy bits. Very few people, I think, go in with that intention. So it really is about reverse engineering. Hey, how do I have a good outcome for both of us? It's almost like that Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, win-win. How do we get, and one of the concepts of the 7 Habits is seek first to understand, so then you can have a win-win situation for everyone. So we have a good conversation. I win because you're happy. You win because you've understood the implications of where we're at, and you're actually still feeling good about your job and our relationship as a leader and a team member. And we all go off and be merry afterwards, ideally.
Merriment. And I think that because there's so much unknown that's going to be presented even in that well-structured discussion, don't have your thought being, we must come out of this with a resolution straight away. No, sometimes things are more complex, or they've presented things and brought things to the table that you think, oh, I wasn't prepared for that. I need time to contemplate. And so if you feel like you're not getting anywhere in that discussion, to make it acceptable, say, you know what, I feel like we're at a stalemate at the moment. Let's both go away, consider things from our perspective, from each other's perspective. Let's meet up again in a couple of days or a day or a week, depending on what it all is about. And we will start conversations again and see if we get any further.
I've written much earlier in our conversation this need for self-awareness. And I think being a leader, it is really important to practice your own self-awareness, because if the conversation is not going well and we ourselves are having our hurdy bits poked, then it's really important as leaders that we're able to almost separate ourselves from that situation that's being triggering in that environment, and be able to say, okay, there's something coming up for me here, and I've got to be the person who doesn't push my own issues onto my team member. So being able to take a step back and being able to take a pause and giving yourself permission to have a pause, giving yourself permission to say, look, I'm hearing A, B, and C, and we'll get into more of the metrics of active listening, and that I'm hearing this. But when I'm hearing this, and I think that that's something that I need to take into consideration more, can we pause on that and make sure that you are giving your team member the comfort that you are going to address that issue. It's not going to be left hanging, because that's the worst thing that can happen, is that the person doesn't feel heard or feel half heard. And then it's something that it hangs over you guys as you go in your day to day. They're thinking, when are you going to talk to me about that thing? And you're thinking
the elephant in the room.
Exactly. So being sure to take a pause, even if that pause is an hour or a day, but making sure that you bring that back into the conversation. So being self-aware and just taking note of the things that are potentially affecting your ability to stay objective in the moment.
And if I could just jump in with the parent-child frame, it's a wonderful example of how it can work. Because if you were speaking to your 5-year-old, they didn't want to go to school, they're acting out because they don't want to go to school, mummy, you always make me do things that I want to do, and then throws in the I hate you, mummy. I'm sure I'm not a mother, but I'm sure it would still hurt you. But you don't put enormous credibility in that comment, because they're 5 and they're acting out. They're in defense mode, they're upset, they're angry, they are trying to hurt me. And so if you can separate yourself like that as a parent in the parent-child frame, you can do it in the boss-employee frame as well, that you can more easily, if you reflect it within that framework, oh, that might be just lashing out a little bit, I'm going to let that one slide. Or no, that could be that's a fair comment. Let's talk about putting a pin in that and raising that one later, and we've got and more time to talk about that one. And it's very interesting as well, Shannyn, because every time you said pause, I wanted to giggle, because that joke has always stuck in my head for the last month, that someone said to me, I think it was Charles that said to me, that a bear goes into a bar and says, can I have a light beer? And the barman said, why the big pause? And he goes, I don't know, I was born with them.
Ba-ding-ching. My only joke that I know, I may add the bear in, is this is the pinnacle of my amusement. So guys who are listening into this is the moment that you'll hear this. Another bar joke. Horse walks into a bar. Barman says, why the long face? If you do have any bar room jokes that are appropriate, please send them in. Going back to
or even inappropriately, give us a laugh.
Probably don't bring bar room jokes into a difficult conversation unless
Maybe have the conversation at the bar, Let's go out for a good drink. Let's get
do it.
smashed, and then I got something to raise with you. I got issues with you. Now, you were talking before about listening and the importance of effectively listening to another human being when you're in this space.
Yeah. So listening is a really important perspective around communication, because if we're going in with a sense of curiosity, we really want to be listening into what's being said on a bunch of different levels. And let me give you more detail about what the bunch of different levels are. So one of the things that they teach you in coaching school is to understand that in order to help someone, you've got to understand their view of the world. And that's one of the things that's really important about being a coach. It's very much about that empathy. If I can understand how you see the world, then I can then interpret the world through your eyes, overlay my interpretation of the world into it, and see if we can come up with a solution that is different to the solution that you've currently got. So it's kind of coaching 101. So with that in mind, whenever we are taught to have a conversation with someone, we remove our own interpretation of the meaning of things. So Julie, you might say, I like the word passionate. I am passionate. Now, passionate is different for different people with different contexts. So I would say something along the lines of, help me to understand what passionate means to you. Because in this context, passionate could be, I'm joyful and excited and enthusiastic, or I'm angry and I'm impassioned and I am feeling, I don't have negative connotations to passion, but there you go. So passion, and this is, words have different meanings. So when you're listening to your team member in these conversations and they say words, it is really helpful to just take a step back and say, help me to understand what that means to you. What do you mean? What do you mean? And being really curious to really understand the perspective of them, so that misunderstandings can actually be understood.
Can be identified.
Yes, misunderstandings can be identified, and then from that place you're able to move forward. Because quite often when we have conversations with people and we get curious about their experience, you can be like, oh no, I never meant for you to think that. That wasn't what I was meaning. Oh, so now I understand. And then quite a lot of the time when we've got these misunderstandings, it's literally a misunderstanding, but we're held up in our fixed sense.
I completely agree with you. And I encourage bosses with their team members to say, this is what it looks like to me. So if I just said to a team member, I want you to be better at your communication with patients, because coming from a dental practice background, I want you to be a better communicator with patients. As you say, what does that actually mean? So extend that out, extrapolate it out and say what that looks like to me is, and then bring it down to specific scenarios. When you welcomed that patient into the surgery, you seemed quite distracted. The computer wasn't turned on properly, and you were actually in the hallway having a conversation socially with a team member before you welcomed them in. So what great customer service looks like to me in that scenario is that when a patient walks in, you're at the desk, everything's turned on because you've turned up early enough to get everything established, and you are there with a big smiling face saying, welcome, come on in, you're in the right place. So that's what it looks like to me. And so then the more specific you can get when you are calling somebody up on negative or unhelpful behavior, or when you're trying to train them in helpful behavior, is to actually, in essence, role play it out so that they can see exactly what you mean.
In saying that, however, there is also that higher level thinking of kind of hang on, because I'm just about to offend you.
Ooh.
No.
This could be our own difficult discussion, Shannyn.
There is actually a way to extend that and have the person be on their own bus in terms of being able to articulate what does good customer service mean to you in this situation? Reverse role play. I want you to be the customer and I'm going to be you in the experience that I observed. How does this make you feel? How would you do it differently? What would success look like from your perspective? That also helps to bridge the gap between their understanding of success and your understanding of success. Because if we're just constantly in that place of saying, here is how I want you to do it, then we're not understanding where the barrier is between our understanding and their understanding. So being able to kind of engage them in part of the process can be a really helpful way of actually behavior change. Because also when they talk about actually, here's what I should have done, they're already on the bus. You're like, yeah, of course, you get it.
Yeah. Wonderful.
So Julie, we've kind of talked a little bit about this. I reckon we could almost do a chapter 2 on this at some stage, because difficult conversations is something, because performance reviews is one of those ones where I know often causes a little bit of controversy, a little bit of challenge. So it's probably not the only time we're going to be talking about difficult conversations. But is there anything that our listeners should or could really take from this podcast today before we wrap it up?
Well, one of my pieces of advice is always, and I think this is an obvious one, never have the difficult discussion while you're hot and angry about it. So always give yourself time to contemplate before you go ahead and have that difficult discussion, and take that proper time to contemplate what's going on from their, what could be going on from their perspective. How could I approach this discussion in a way that's going to create the environment for success? Let's identify what success looks like for me in that, so I can reverse engineer back from that. But the only additional thing I would suggest is, just despite your best efforts, you may still get a negative response, and that's okay. That's okay. That's, go back to our episode on free will. People have a right to react as in any way that they want, and it might be a very unhelpful way, and then you can manage that quite separately. But if things don't go according to plan, that's okay. Everything's difficult until it's easy. And when I've tackled the difficult discussions in a very proactive, very thoughtful way, I was amazed at how quickly the anxiety around having future difficult discussions started to deplete. 3-4 well-managed difficult discussions, and you start to become far more emboldened around it with far less anxiety.
Brilliant advice. And so if you thought this advice was brilliant, we would love a 5-star review. If you give us less than a 5-star review, we will probably have a difficult discussion with you. we will track you down, and we will talk about the outcome of this conversation is that I want you to give us a 5-star review, and I'm just going to talk to you until your ears are bleeding. And if anyone knows me, they know that I would be able to do that. So anyway.
That sounds like fun. So a 5-star review would be fantastic. Any comments would also be welcome. Again, only positive ones. And have a lovely week or fortnight until I speak to you next, Shannyn.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, listeners. Always great to have any conversation with you, Julie. And I look forward to speaking to you next time.
Beautiful. Me too. Ciao, ciao.